watching Shalom TV, celebrating Jewish culture. Funding for Shalom TV has been provided by the following. And by viewers like you.
On September 11th, 2001, the world changed and to this day has never been the same. My guess is that if you were alive on 9/11/2001, you remember every detail of your life that day, where you were when you first heard the news that a plane, then two planes, had flown into the World Trade Center building at the southern tip of Manhattan, where you were when the majestic towers crumbled into dust before our very eyes, with angry, billowing, gray clouds of dust chasing people down avenues and streets, as if from some fantasy horror or disaster film. Where you were when you read the accounts of the death and destruction, saw photos of human beings jumping to their deaths in futile attempts to escape from towering infernos, and how you were touched by the countless stories of extraordinary heroism and sacrifice of police officers and firefighters and health professionals and ordinary citizens who reached out to one another in an enthralling display of human compassion and caring. Where you were when you saw Mayor Giuliani walking the streets of New York, representing the resolve and determination of the city, if not the country. Or where you were when President Bush visited Ground Zero and stood with his bullhorn and an arm around the fire commissioner. And you probably remember how the American flag suddenly had a new meaning, how it appeared on homes, on car windshields, seemingly everywhere. It's all seared into our consciousness. And suddenly it's 10 years later, and it still seems like just a very short time ago. And so we'd like to spend a moment reflecting on that day, the impact it's had on this country, as seen through the eyes of a number of people who lived through the horror of 9/11. And so I'm very honored to be joined by Ari Schonbrun, who on 9/11 was an employee at Cantor Fitzgerald's, where he was on the 78th floor of Tower 1 of the World Trade Center when the plane struck the building. And Ari is the author of a new book, Miracles and Fate on 78. Morty Dzikansky, a retired NYPD terrorism expert and the author of Terrorist Cop, whose wife, Meryl, was at the World Trade Center on 9/11, and Morty immediately was on the scene and was involved in police work at the site. And I'm also extremely pleased to be joined by Dr. Liz Goren, a psychologist and psychotherapist who, after 9/11, worked with dozens of rescuers and survivors of the World Trade Center attack, especially firefighters, which she writes about in her book, Beyond the Reach of Ladders. And I thank you all for taking a moment to be with us. Thank you very, very much. Ari, your book is entitled Miracles and Fate on 78. You were on the 78th floor. Can you briefly recount what you remember happening that morning?
I was running late, basically, and that's a whole nother story that I don't have time to get into. It was because of my son and some schoolwork that he had to do. And I was normally in my office between 8 and 8:30, and that morning, because of what was going on at home, I didn't get to the office. I didn't get to the building until 20 to 9. My office was on 101, and the only way to get up there was to take an express elevator from the lobby to 78, and then on 78 you switched for what they call the local elevators to take you to the higher floors. And I was in between elevators. I was walking across the lobby, and as best as I can describe, there was an explosion. The lights went out, the place filled with smoke. I was literally thrown off my feet. I was on the floor. And as I tell my audiences, I was screaming. I had no idea what had happened, but I'd never been so scared in my life. And ultimately, I bumped into a coworker of mine who was on the elevator that I was about to get on. And I found her wandering in the halls. She had third-degree burns up and down her arms. Her clothes were burned. Her hair was singed.
Where
was a
had she
mess.
been?
She was on the elevator that I was about to get on when the plane hit. The doors had started to close. And, you know, the walls and the ceiling collapsed in the elevator, and the cables snapped, was sparking in the elevator, and the jet fuel coming down in the elevator were ignited by the sparks. And, you know, the doors had jammed open, thank God. They jammed open like a foot, and she jumped through the fire.
But she was
to get
burned
out.
badly.
She was burned very badly. And I'll never forget, she saw me, and she looked at me, and she said to me, Ari, please help me. And whatever you do, please don't leave me. It was interesting because we weren't very good friends, all right? Our relationship was cold at best. And, you know, she almost got me fired the year before. None of that mattered. I mean, none of that was, it just, you know, there was another human being in trouble. God put me in that position, and he said, you know, go. And
What did you do?
And I coached her down 78 flights of stairs. It's a long story, but we managed to get out. There were a whole bunch of things that happened along the way that were just, you know, miracles in and of themselves.
Tell me one.
I was on the 75th floor in the stairwell, and my cell phone rang. And you're going to go, so what? Well, in 2001, there weren't as many cell towers. In the Trade Center, you could never get signal. You just couldn't. I remember standing by the window of my office trying to get signal. You couldn't do it. And here I was on a day where there was literally no signal. I'm in the middle of the stairwell, in the middle of the building, right? And the phone rang. I was so shocked. I picked it up. I was like, hello? It was my wife on the other end of that phone. And she was crying and telling me something about a plane and the building, whatever. I had no idea. And I'll never forget. I said to Joyce, I'm in the stairwell. I'm on the 75th floor. I'm on my way down. Now is not a good time. I said, I'll call you when I get out of the building, and I hung up the phone. So at least she knew that I wasn't killed when the plane went in. And to me, that was more important than anything. So
You got down to the ground floor safely?
we got down to the ground floor safely. Virginia and I got down
Did
safely.
Virginia survive?
Virginia survived.
Good for
She
you.
absolutely did. Virginia saved my life. Yeah, and I know people look at that and they go like, I don't get it. Well, the reality is that had I not been with her, I don't know if we would have gotten down as quickly as we did, because, you know, when we got down about the 38th floor, it was backed up wall-to-wall people, and you couldn't get through. And I just started yelling out, you know, is there a paramedic in the building? If you're a paramedic, you know, we need help. I have a burn victim. Otherwise, please, you know, step to the right and let us through. And they did. People just moved over and they let us through. So then they created a path for us to go down. When we ultimately got out of the building and I ultimately got her into an ambulance, she insisted that I go with her to the hospital. And believe me, I didn't want to go anywhere, you know, not on that day, you know. And I said, you don't need me anymore. You know, my work is done. You're going to get to the hospital. You're going to be fine. And she turned to the ambulance driver and said, we're not leaving unless he comes with us. And she pointed to me. And the ambulance driver was looking at me like, you know, this is not a cab service. But I got into the ambulance and we got away. And what I learned later was we were one of only a few ambulances that actually got away from the scene. If she would not have insisted that I get into that ambulance, I would have been standing at the base of that building when it came down, and you'd be interviewing somebody else today.
By the way, when this is happening, do you process in your mind that a plane has hit the building?
No.
This is something you learn later.
This is something I learned when I got out of we knew, I heard, as I said, my wife told me a plane went into the building, but I was thinking a Cessna or, you know, one of these little Piper Cubs or something like that. It was only when we got out of the building and I ultimately got Virginia into the ambulance, when I turned around and saw the buildings and what had gone on, there was a guy standing next to me and I said to him, how did building 2 get on fire? Because I knew about building 1. My wife told me a plane went in, but I didn't know about building 2. I never heard the second plane. And the guy says to me, what are you talking about? 2 jetliners went into the buildings. They're calling it a terrorist attack. I was so shocked. I was so scared. I was really, really scared. And I couldn't get any signal on my phone. I couldn't call anybody. It was just a question of, what do you do? In and out of the ambulance, Virginia asked me to call her mom. I couldn't get a hold of her mom. It's a nightmare.
You'll tell me if this question has any meaning. How long do you stay scared?
It was a few weeks.
Mm-hmm.
It was definitely a few weeks that I was scared. We got my phone rang that night with some Israeli radio station that wanted to interview me. It was 3:30 in the morning. And when the phone rang and the guy started talking to me, my wife says, "Hang up, it could be a terrorist." And I'm going like, it didn't make, when I think about it now, that's the most ridiculous thing in the world. But, we were so scared that it made sense to me. And I went like, no, they're not terrorists. It's okay. But we were scared. I'll tell you something else. When we took out bin Laden, believe it or not, when I left my house that morning, I was looking around for snipers. I have no idea why. I was just scared.
In some way, the fear has never left you. In some way.
Correct. It's just, we put it, we suppress it. Because otherwise we couldn't, if I didn't suppress it, I wouldn't be able to deal with life, and life goes on.
Liz, you're listening to this. My guess is that whether you've heard Ari's story specifically or not, there must be something about it that reminds you of other stories you've heard. You've talked to so many people who were rescuers or survivors, and one of the things you write about in your book, and I have to see if I remember the phrase correctly, is you talk about how people react after they survived, including sometimes feeling guilty that they survived. But in your experience, when Ari talks about this fear that was certainly there for weeks, when you talked to firefighters, professionals, to what extent was this event comprehensible for them?
Well, I think it was incomprehensible for them, and it's for all of us. And to me, what survivor guilt is largely about, it's certainly initially, it's so complex, but one of it is, how do you comprehend? How do you understand, I survived, I got out, and others didn't. And as I was listening to you talk about the fear, I was thinking that it is with people, it's people, I actually heard many reactions of other people, firefighters, who reacted when they heard of bin Laden's assassination. There was something about that that got to them that just brought the memories back.
It awakened it.
It reawakened it. We find a way to put things away is part of what, Ari, you're talking about, and it's more than fear. It's spiritual, it's existential, it truly is. How do you understand life? One minute you're there, and the next minute you're not, or the things that can happen.
You were where when 9/11 occurred?
I was sitting in my office, not very unlike where we are today, talking to someone, looking across from someone in Greenwich Village.
Greenwich Village.
And I'm talking to this person, and we started our session at 8:45, and from the corner of my eye, I see this plane going down Fifth Avenue very low. Now, in regular life, of course, I would say something like, "Did you see that?" But I was in therapy, so I didn't say anything until my building shook seconds later. And when the building shook, it just broke through my therapist's role. I couldn't help but saying, I said, "Did you hear that? What is that?" And all I could think of is I couldn't comprehend it. I said, "Oh, it must have broken the sound barrier," which shows you my little understanding of science and life. So we went on with our session. And at the end of the session, when I came out, my office mate was jiggling the radio trying to get a signal. And he told me we finally, radio service was out, the cell service, all the phone service was out. It took us a little while to figure out what was going on. And then we got, give us 22 minutes, we'll give you the world. And over that, we heard a plane is hit. So we didn't know very much initially, but then from the office, we watched the towers on fire, and just watching it, and then they collapsed.
You remember that?
I remember that, and I remember thinking, this is a movie, only it isn't.
Yes.
It's real.
So Morty, your wife was at the World Trade Centers.
Yeah, she at the time was actually in the World Financial Center, which is diagonally across
Right.
from the World Trade Center. And she was working for Lehman Brothers. And she was on the 10th floor in a conference. And she actually saw the first plane go into the North Tower. She immediately knew this was a terror attack. I mean, I must have rubbed off the cop in me, to realize that things like this just don't happen. It was a clear day. It didn't make any sense. And she actually was a hero that day. She helped evacuate all her coworkers, and she kept a steady head. But I kept thinking, once I found out, why is she there and I'm at home in Long Beach?
How did you hear about it?
She actually called the house, but I just thought it was unbelievable. Here it was, that day I'm a Manhattan South homicide detective, meaning I cover from 59th Street to the Battery, from east to west. This is my territory, and this is going on. And why is a VP of Lehman Brothers escaping terror? And I'm sitting in Long Beach, with my 1.5-year-old, off that day. And that morning in particular, of course, I didn't work Friday nights and Saturday because I was unorthodox. The police department allowed me to take off Shabbat unless it was an emergency, which this automatically became an emergency. Became an emergency for a few months. I had a decision: do I go in that morning or not? Because they gave me a little flexibility. I had to be there when they needed me, but also I had to make up certain days. And I always kept, a record of days. That morning, I just woke up saying, you know what? I feel lazy. It's a beautiful day. I'll just hang out with my son, and I'm not going in. And the rest is history. And
What did you do after the call came in?
I had the biggest dilemma in my life because, on the one hand, I'm a father, and we don't know if mommy's coming home. And I lost my mother when I was very young, and I realized how tragic and impact it would have on my son. Secondly, I'm a New York City detective, and to this day, I say the detective in me came out and say, I have to go in. It's not even an option not to, but hopefully I'll hear from my wife that she's okay. Because the reality is, when New York City, it sort of felt like, somebody was shooting at us, and the cop's job is to go into the fire and not run away from the fire. So I knew I had to go in. And thank God I got that one phone call telling me that she got to her father's store on the Lower East Side, and now I take off the father's hat and I become the detective again. And again, I have an unusual experience that I both witnessed firsthand, Ground Zero, immediately afterwards, and all the suicide bombings I attended in Israel. And I can describe every single detail in Israel that I've seen, from beginning to end, what I was doing that day. For whatever reason, with 9/11, I have so many blanks.
Interesting.
And my problem is I have a unique window to share with people because we can't forget. We can't forget about what happened in Israel, and especially what happened here on 9/11. And I want to tell the rest of the world who just saw on CNN and Fox what happened. And I have blanks. I don't want to fill the blank unless it's clear. Mm-hmm. But I was there. I know I was there. I physically was there. I was there that morning. I was there that night. But I remember every awareness was on that day. In other words, some days, you're a little tired. There was no sense of being tired or anything. The key was just, when can I get my next cup of coffee? Because I got to stay awake. I got to be up, who knows, 24, 48. The amount of hours they need me, I'll work.
Mm-hmm. Did you lose friends that day, Ari?
We lost 658. I lost 658 coworkers that day. When I went through the list of names, I realized I personally knew about 500 of them. So I attended more funerals in a short span of time than most people attend in their lifetimes. I lost a lot of good friends.
At any point along the way here, do you cry?
I think about this every single day. And I won't say there isn't a day that goes by, but there isn't a week that goes by that at some point in time I'm not crying. Mm-hmm. It hit me hard, but I've overcome. And like I said, I go out and I speak because it's so important. As Morty said, he doesn't want anybody to forget. I don't want anybody to forget. You can go out, especially when you go out in the Midwest or on the West Coast, and people don't remember anymore. And it's frightening. It's absolutely frightening. People they don't remember, they were too young, or it's just, it's become, just a piece of history. It happened, but it doesn't affect the people anymore like it used to, and that's a very bad thing. You talk about, Holocaust survivors, and, we talk about the Holocaust. Now, I'm not comparing the Twin Towers to the Holocaust, please. But that's something that nobody will ever forget, all right? The Twin Towers was bad, and it's something that we shouldn't forget. We should always feel it, and we don't.
Do you have children?
I have 5 children.
How many did you have in 2001?
I had 4.
You had 4 children.
I had 4 children, and as a matter of fact, my youngest at the time was 6 years old. After he was born, the doctors told my wife she would not be able to have any more children. They were wrong. Yoni was born in 2003. I call him my miracle baby. I call him my 9/11 baby. And people ask me, why do you think you got out? Why do you think you were saved? And one of the things I say is because that soul needed to come down to this earth. That baby needed to be born. And if I wouldn't have been around, he wouldn't have been born. And he's one of the reasons that, God decided to spare me.
Do you hear a lot of that?
I hear so much of what you're saying. I mean, I was thinking about one of the men that is in my book, who, a number of the people I worked with, both firefighters and other survivors and people who are deeply involved, went through a real crisis of faith. Some people kind of found God that day, and other people went through a real crisis of faith. And one of the men who I write about and who worked with me for a long time, really, he said, I don't believe anymore. I don't believe anymore, a firefighter. And then over time, he ended up getting divorced. He had a very tragic story that came out of 9/11, and then he got remarried, and he said, maybe that's why I survived, to have these babies. And he had twins. I certainly do hear that.
Did you lose anybody that day?
Well, there was a female officer who I knew well. Her name was Moira Smith. She was a uniform officer. My office was on 20th Street in the police academy at 13th Precinct. That's where homicide worked out of. So she was a regular uniform officer, working all the different shifts, but their locker room was right next to our office. So you just say hello in passing. And she just looked like the sweetest, like if that was your daughter, you wouldn't let her be a cop. She was just too sweet and too nice. But she was a tough cop. And what ended up happening that day, she saw the planes heading in downtown. She never asked, do I go downtown? She never asked, what do I do? She immediately went down there. And they have pictures, actually, newspapers caught her, covered in soot, carrying people out, injured people out. And she would bring them out and go back in. It's one thing the first time, but to repeatedly do something with all the debris falling and everything that was going on. So if I think of one face, of one person who really both was a hero and then a tragic victim. And again, I call...
What happened to her?
She died that day. And,
Do you know how?
Debris fell on her.
Debris fell.
Debris fell. And it could be at the start as the buildings were collapsing. But the thing I always say is, it's because of people like that that we're here today. And the strength. And she had a little girl, and I mean, what a wonderful soul she was. And by a miracle, again, my wife wasn't killed, and she had just injured her ankle in Israel, and she was about to get operated on about 6 months ago. And ironically, her ankle was even worse because it was a terror attack, a suicide bombing in Israel, and that delayed her entry into. They had more immediate surgery that had to happen. So now she was sort of on standby. So here it is, you have somebody trying to flee the buildings and also evacuating her office. So she acted heroically, but she's limited her speed herself of getting out because of a terror attack in Israel. How much more connected could we be of, fighting this? And again, I use the word tragedy. Tragedy is a car accident. This was a horrific act of evil. And I think that's the thing I try to emphasize over and over and over again. This wasn't something that happened by accident. If the pilot fell asleep, Sully, because Sully's here, many people are alive because of the U.S. Air. That was an accident. And had it not worked out,
It's about the plane that landed on the Hudson River.
So he's a hero. And, it's misfortune that eagles go into, but this was a personification of evil, the indiscriminate. This wasn't an attack of military barracks. This was a purely civilian attack. And I can't imagine how much evil one human being can have in order to commit an act like this.
For me, while the evil was just so apparent, it was breathtaking. What was more breathtaking for me was the story of the officer that Morty just talked about, the police officer, and all the hundreds of stories of police officers and firefighters who went into the buildings to try to save people knowing they were putting their lives at risk. And I've read, and Morty, maybe you've heard this too, all of you may, I've heard stories of policemen going up flights of stairs, and they had to know their chances of ever coming down were remote at best, but it was their job. And I've heard many stories of police men and women going into buildings to save other people, putting their lives at risk. And for me, as bad as the evil was, 9/11 evoked an extraordinary amount of human goodness. And I take that away. For me, the story of the people who flew into the plane, they're hideous, but they're minuscule to me compared to the heroism of the officer. What was her first name again?
Moira.
Spell it.
Moira.
Moira, okay. Moira, or in some way, heroism may not have been what you chose. It may have been thrust upon you, but you didn't walk away from it. And whether you liked the lady or not, you stayed with her. And you got her down, and you couldn't have understood when it happened how lucky you were going to be. But you stayed with her because of some goodness inside of you. And to me, the goodness of this event so dwarfs even the extraordinary horror. Now, I didn't live through it, so it may be easy for me to say, but that's how I experienced it, and I want to know your reaction, Ari.
It's so true. I remember I was probably on the 36th or 35th floor going down, and I vividly, distinctly remember two firefighters that were walking up. I see their faces every day. All right, one had glasses, the other one had a mustache, and I vividly see them. And I remember when I got out of the building and I saw how bad the fire was, my first thought was, well, I saw the firefighters going in there. They're going to get this thing out. They'll put it out. Pretty much, damage to the building. Hey, it'll take them a couple of months to get it fixed. I can use a vacation.
Very real. Very real.
But you're absolutely right. The amount of goodness and kindness that, and not only that day, obviously, it was for months and months and months. The thing that bothers me, though, I remember the day after, and 2 days in a week, and 2 weeks in a month. New York had changed. The city had changed. Everybody was nice, and everybody was kind, and everybody was flying flags, and everybody was. It was a united city, and it lasted 6 months. And 6 months later, the city went right back to being what it was. And that bothered me. See, I changed, and I didn't change overnight. People ask me about that, I didn't decide to become a rabbi. I wasn't going to sit on a mountain. I wasn't going to be, secluding myself and just talking to God. That's not who I was. I was the same guy on Wednesday that I was on Tuesday. The difference was it took time until it sank in, what had happened to me and how I was saved.
How have you changed?
I like to think I've become a better person. I have become a kinder person. I took upon myself one thing that stands out of my mind to change, and that was the cursing aspect. I decided that I was no longer going to curse. And you won't hear a four-letter word come out of my mouth other than golf. You won't hear it. And as a matter of fact, and what that has done is it has changed the people around me. Because remember, I work on Wall Street. All right, drunken sailors have nothing on these guys. But when they're around my desk, you won't hear a foul language coming out of anybody's mouth. And if they happen to do it, they'll go like, I'm sorry, I didn't mean it. So the decision that I made has affected people all around me. And that's what I try and do. I try and get people to make one change. And I tell them, you make that change in you, you will see how it will affect you and the people around you. And, you know, for the good, obviously.
Did you in any way become more patriotic?
I don't know that I became more patriotic. I was always a patriotic American. I mean, proud to be an American in this country, proud to be Jewish. I think I became a more religious person, although when I first started talking in the first 6 months, I would deny that. People would say, you know, did you become more religious? And I'd say no. But looking back over time, I think I have become a more religious person. And
Do you mean more spiritual, or do you mean more observant?
Both. Both. I've certainly become more observant, but I have become more spiritual. I mean, things affect me more. I'm more attuned to, you know, what's going on in the world, and I'll always ask myself, I wonder why God's doing that. I wonder why God's doing that. It's a little strange, and people think I'm crazy, but that's okay.
Did you change?
I think after 9/11, I realized how ineffective I could be as a police officer, as a detective. When, like I say, there were 20 murders in my zone, which is a very big area, on September 10th. And on one day later, I have over 3,000 in my area. And I could do nothing. Mm-hmm. I like wearing a cape. Although I need the extra large, I like wearing the cape. And once, you know, I wasn't born that way, I wasn't built that way, but once you put it on me, you can't take it off. And I realized I couldn't fly. I realized I had no role in this. I realized I had no contribution. And to me, I was never used to that. That never happened to me, not in my 20 years. You know, if there was a crack epidemic, I was busting crack dealers. Whatever the time called for, I would be there to be able to do something. And thank God, both Commissioner Kelly and God gave me the opportunity to go to Israel, to feel like I could contribute to this fight of evil.
How about your wife? You've heard how Ari reacted to this, how he was frightened for quite a period of time, and then he has described some changes he feels has happened to him. Your wife was closer to the actual moment. Has she ever talked about, A, her sense of fear, and 2, as her husband, have you seen a change in her?
Well, from what I initially saw, we lived at the time in Long Beach. And in the house where we lived, we were on the flight path directly between all European flights going to Kennedy flew over our house, and generally about 5 in the morning. And we had the luxury of having this open air glass, of which I loved. But it was not the greatest idea when you have a plane flying over your house, so she went through some trauma with that. But I'll tell you, take a year and a half later, we have those twins. So we have our Jake and Talia come into our life, and that's part of the reason. And she's a VP of Lehman Brothers. You know, I jokingly say, you know, I had a sugar mama, so you know, it was good. It was good being a civil servant back then. And she gave up that job. She packed up the house. We sold the house to go to Suicide Bomb Central a year later. So here it is after experiencing, and we have been going back and forth to Israel. We went there on a honeymoon. I mean, we've been going there our whole life. So terrorism is nothing new to us. But imagine packing up a house, having lap babies, 2 of them. So there was no joy in Mudville on that El Al flight with our 3-year-old, and moving to Israel, where she wasn't going to be working. She gave up that job to where all this is going on, just for 2 reasons: to first support me, and also she felt if we didn't do that, they win. we have to win. We have to live our lives, and that is the key to all of this.
So I want to ask you a sort of twofold question.
Okay.
It's not simply you're a professional who then talked to people because you were in Greenwich Village. You actually
Right.
saw the plane.
Right.
You felt the explosion. You, in part, are a survivor yourself. Not directly at the site, but you were much closer than most of us were to the actual event. So you hear two people here who, to varying degrees, were also involved personally. I'd love to hear any thoughts you have as you hear them. And then I'm asking you the same question. Do you feel you changed personally, Liz,
Okay.
after 9/11?
I'll answer the first because I have a lot more to say. I have
Okay,
many
fair enough.
reactions
Okay.
to both of you. To the first, before 9/11, I was kind of, I was kind of happy living my life, and my kids were grown up. They were out of the city. They were, and I thought, I love my patients. I love my work, but I sort of felt like, oh, there's got to be something more happening in life, but I don't know what it is. I did not. And I kind of think I took my practice and my work for granted in a way. And the thing I learned that I always knew, I always cited, the nature of my work itself is about change one person, you change the world. I kind of, I don't know, I think I stopped appreciating it. The thing that 9/11 did for me is I really came to appreciate that one, not just in my work, just everyone. And my experience was, I really, from all the people I worked with, and of course firefighters, what they're about is saving lives, and just as police officers, it's I felt that people have changed from it. Yes, there's fear, and there's the fear of terrorism, but in New York City, I just, on the surface, the pulse of life is there, and it's back to its crazy, insane self, and everybody's sort of preoccupied. But I feel, and I think that people, there is an awareness, a kind of willingness to help, a sense of an individual reaching out to another individual that I feel has changed, that people do have more appreciation of bonding with each other in general. I really do feel, and I think that's persisted. Well, I also think that I see young people who grew up, like these young kids who grow up right after 9/11, they grew up in a whole other world. Their world is a world of terrorism and of fear. And I think they have, it's very, in a way, a sad situation, but it's they have a whole other struggle to deal with, as opposed to those of us, in a way, who our world, we were American innocence in a way. They're like, this could never happen here. Yeah, it happens elsewhere. It happens in Israel. It happens, but not here in New York City.
Okay, now react to them.
I guess I disagreed with you on the one sense of America and of people going right back to where they are. We often don't talk to each other. We live on the surface, but underneath, I think people are more. I agree with. I was thinking what both of you have talked about, and the fact that we've all written books, I think, speaks to, like, it's so important. And I share the feeling that I sense from both of you of, like, how do we remember? It is so, and it's easy to feel like, and it's part of what you were talking about. Oh, it seems like people forget. You were saying across the country. My sense is people have a memory, but the memory of 9/11, it's become an idea. It's an idea to them, or a commodity. And I felt myself not to be a survivor, but a witness. I really feel like I've been a witness. I was alongside and in it, and living in it alongside with people. And I feel that what's so important is, and that we're committed to that, and that's part of, our tradition and our history and our faith. It's like, how do you remember in a way that's meaningful? And so, I was actually very moved that you kept bringing us back to, tell me your story, tell me, and to me that's how, we need to find a way to remember that is not so painful that then the impulse is to block it out. And people who are far away who know of idea, they don't really understand. and how to make memory alive in a way that we can do something with it, meaningful, morally, emotionally.
I want to change the focus for one moment. We're a group of Jews. This was not intrinsically a Jewish event. This was an attack against our country, America. But there may be something about the fact that all of us experience it from within ourselves, and we do bring a Jewish sensibility to things. And, you know, as you said, prior to 9/11, it always happened elsewhere. But one of the places it always happened
Right.
was Israel. And all of a sudden, it's here. And you can almost hear the unspoken message from Israel. Now you understand more about what we have been dealing with. Would you mind talking to me for one moment about how you experienced this as a Jew, not simply as an American? And if there's anything you learned or you feel that we could learn as Jews from the experiences the three of you bring. Ari, may I begin with you?
You know, it was interesting because when I first started talking, and I do a Q&A at the end of my talk, and one of the first questions that I'd be asked, because I spoke to predominantly Jewish audiences, and the first question was, how many Jews died? How many Jews were killed? And it used to hurt me when they asked that question.
Interesting.
Because my feeling after seeing the death and the destruction was, who cares if they were Jewish or they weren't Jewish? Well, that shouldn't matter, how many Jews. But as time went on, you know, and somebody asked me that question, and I said, you know, what difference does it make? And he says, because we've heard so many stories about how the Jews knew that this was going on, and that was where the question was coming from. And I said, that's a different story. And of course, you know, it was like, you know, the Jews knew, and that's why they stayed home, whatever. I says, well, I'm going to tell you this, all right? Somebody missed me on the list, because I never got the call.
And every other Jew missed the same call.
Yeah, whoever died.
And how about the link to Israel? Is
Well,
there anything
I
there
was
for you?
100%. My parents live in Israel. I lived in Israel. I was there during the '73 war. I remember, you know, the air raid sirens. I remember going into the air raid shelters, and I mean, it was very, very real. And this was, and of course, I remember calling my parents during the Iraqi war, the first Iraqi war, and you know, my mother on the phone, and she's garbled, and I said, "What's the matter, Ma?" She goes, "I'm wearing my gas mask, and we're in the sealed room. I can't talk to you now." So all of these things, you know, were reverberating in my mind when this happened. And, you know, I went like, I think, as you said, I think the United States finally gets it, that this is what Israel goes through every single day, all right? Now maybe America will wake up and stop putting pressure on Israel, and, you know, they'll let Israel do the things that they need to do. Unfortunately, our politicians did not see it that way, and unfortunately, they're still forcing Israel to do what they shouldn't be doing.
It's as if this question were written for you. I know you were actually in Israel during the Gulf War, and you have a whole history here, but I want you still to speak to it. To what extent, you know, as a Jew, are there implications here for you?
Well, the first thought was the reverse phone call. I remember calling Israel daily when Bus 18 would be blowing up on a Sunday morning, call my cousins who live in Yerushalayim, call friends, call family, making that constant phone call, is everybody okay? You know, you couldn't get through for the first couple of minutes because the phone lines were so busy. All of a sudden, they were calling our way. And not only that, but everyone had went to my wife's office at Lehman Brothers, so they knew the proximity. They knew that was part of the New York tour that they took. So they knew the connection. I know as a person, look, Israel could be in dire straits. If I could do anything to help, I'm getting on a plane. And my kids are going to get on a plane. My wife's going to get, everyone's getting on a plane. There's no issue of during good times or bad times. So as a Jew, it didn't change. Now we have to leave New York. God forbid, you know, anyone who packed up and left New York right then and there, they're not a New Yorker. They take away their New York citizenship, and they're no longer, you know, they can maybe pay taxes in New York, but that's the extent of their connection to New York. Listen, it just seems like within my life, you know, again, I'm an American, I'm Jewish, a New York City detective. This sort of has been following me. And it's always been a part. And again, it was never an issue. I was actually brought in because there was an aguna issue. There was an issue with people who we didn't recover. How are we going to make sure that the wife could go on and remarry or whatever the circumstance may be? So I went to a lot of roundtables that we talked about identification and what do we do in a circumstance like that, and this is a unique thing. So it was Jewish, but it was an American issue. It was a New York issue. It's funny because people ask me where I'm from. And it's very confusing these days because living in Israel, doing a lot of traveling here in the States, and all the speaking. I'm a New Yorker. That's my credo. That's how I identify myself. And I'm an obvious Jew. I'm out of the closet. If there was an issue with Jewish marriage, I'd be on the front line. Getting the first license to get married. So there always, terror has been a part of my life since I've been born.
Neither of you spoke, and I haven't heard Liz yet, about the fact that this was a Muslim terrorist attack. And every now and then you hear something like this. If Israel weren't occupying the West Bank, all the problems of the Middle East would be solved. And the extent to which, in some way, Israel is held responsible for 9/11 was something I also wanted you to speak about. Whether you've ever heard that, how you relate to it, and in some way, does the link now, not something between a terrorist act and our being Americans here and having to witness the tragedy of 9/11, but in some way people are blaming Israel for Muslim extremism that causes 9/11.
Well, listen, fortunately or unfortunately, people who study history, this extremism was there way before Israel ever even existed. This infidel issue, if you're not one of us, then you're dead. So the fact of Israel, listen, Israel is an excuse, but it's for any thinking person, a total unrealistic excuse. It makes no sense whatsoever. It's just an excuse. It's a diversion. We're great, as we call beard. No, it's something to talk about when you're not dealing with the real issues.
1948, there were no occupied territories. They tried to kill us. 1956, nobody was occupying any territories. They tried to kill us. 1967, they all went to war. That's when we captured. That's when we liberated the territories. We don't occupy the territories. They're not occupied territories. They're liberated territories. All right. All of a sudden, fast forward now, if Israel would only go back to the 67 borders, there'd be peace. Why? Was there peace before? What do you think? It's an excuse. As Morty say, it's an excuse. All right? Plain and simple.
Well, I relate to that question. I look at anti-Israel, a kind of character assassination is no different than anti-Muslim, and to sort of have a blanket anti-Muslim. I work with many Muslims. I work with people from all religious faiths and backgrounds and everywhere on the block. And I just think it's very sad to get very caught up, and that's part of what I'm about and work I do and just how I relate in the world, which I feel is so key to me, to my sense of what it means to be a Jew, and being open. And I think this is a very sort of touchy subject, I'll just say. I know people have asked me a lot about, well, how, for example, have the firefighters, or how do people downtown react to the Muslim Cultural Center? And I think people's reactions have, they go around the block. They run the gamut. I personally would hate to see us lowering ourselves to the kind of level of hatred of what I understand as a psychologist, as an analyst, to look at responding to hatred with hatred. I mean, it's something that's I'm really repugnant to me. I wanted to just say one thing I was thinking, this evoked for me, and I thought about before as we were talking. I worked down at Ground Zero with the relief workers the day they bombed Afghanistan, and the thing that so struck me is that those relief workers, those people who were there, living, working in the reality of the devastation and destruction and what that produces, they weren't, they were not into vengeance. That the more further, when you're really in the midst of a reality of what I think hatred can breed, I think they were far less bellicose than people at a distance. It's in a way easier to get angry and at a distance. To me, this experience as a Jewish person, what I felt when I left my building and I was walking to the corner, I had to make a decision. Am I going to go to the right, try to get on the subway and go home and be safe, or go to the left and to St. Vincent's Hospital, which was just several blocks away, where I was convinced there would be all these injured. Unfortunately, they were not where they were going to bring people. And I made a left. And I just kept feeling, I thought, well, I don't know all the many reasons, but I kept feeling like, what is this about now? And I felt like God is watching to see, what are we going to do with this? What will we do with it? And to me, that's a very key part of what it means to be Jewish.
I just want to clarify, when I made my statements, I wasn't telling you that I hate Muslims, okay? The only thing my point was that it was an excuse for the terrorism, for the terrorist acts. Not every Muslim is a terrorist, okay? Just so happens that every terrorist happens to be a Muslim, but that's besides the point.
No, it's not besides the point. In some way, it is the point. And at the moment, we're living in a society which struggles with that reality, and it makes some people uncomfortable. But it's a reality that's very important to remember. And I'm not trying to correct you. I think there was an irony to what you were saying, and I wanted everybody to understand you were making a point, and it's a very important point.
Well, my whole feeling with this is, listen, I talk very often on the topic, and obviously I use the word radical Islam. That's the way I describe it. What I've seen lacking within the 99.9% people who are not directly involved with terrorism, who have no key, is their lack of renouncing it. Is their lack, because they'll justify it. They'll say because Israel's in the West Bank. Killing a civilian is not justified to anybody or any group. And just because that's a very interesting statement, they say if we only left, they're threatening now a third intifada. Okay, so if you don't get your way in political talks, we're going to start blowing up cafes. What normal people do that? What rational people do this? So the reality is, listen, cop has to have a bad guy. Without a bad guy, I don't have a job. If they're not bank robbers, then I just stay at home and that's it. But what I see needed are leadership who will take charge and say, you know what, no matter what, it is wrong to hurt a civilian. That is my mantra.
One thing you said made me uncomfortable.
Just one?
Only one. Only one. And this is maybe just a personal thing on my part, but I still want to hear what you have to say. I don't believe that anyone who didn't make it out of the building didn't make it out of the building because God didn't want them out of the building. And for you to say that the reason you made it in your mind was that God wanted something for you, for example, to be the father of your next child, makes me uncomfortable, because the flip side of that is, what does it say God meant for all those who didn't get out of the building? And I would say it differently as a Jew. And it's sort of what Liz alluded to before. We come from a tradition where we believe God has created a world and has given us, through various ways, and continues to give us, insight into what it means to be a lovelier and lovelier person. For Jews, a Torah, which in some way is the foundation of a worldview of how one embraces life. And then every one of us has a Yetzer Hara and a Yetzer Tov, and our job is to develop the sensitivities through the Yetzer Tov and to become lovelier and lovelier people and be more and more responsible. And we live in a world where there are people who fly planes into buildings. God did nothing to make those planes fly into the building. The buildings fell because of the physical laws of nature that God has established. But then people have the ability to choose how they're going to react to everything in life, including when a woman that you didn't particularly like falls out of an elevator, half burned to death, and instead of saying to her, I've got to take care of myself, you walk her down. And my own feeling is that I don't want to say to a survivor, a Holocaust survivor or a 9/11 survivor, I'm going to tell you what the philosophy of life is. In my mind, a survivor gets a pass. They can feel and say anything they want. But since we're talking, I want to say to you, I am impressed by your soul. And if there's a God in heaven, God loves your soul because of who you are. God did not do you a favor and did not spare you, while he did no favor for the person who didn't make it out of that building. And I feel it's dangerous to teach children that there's a God who makes those kind of choices. And that while I'm thrilled for you, I would rather have you teach that every one of us has opportunities to live a life of righteousness and to make the world better. And yes, if we can save one person, our tradition says we've saved the entire world. And that becomes our job. And I believe God roots like crazy for people like you and people like you and people like you. And then it's up to people like you and you and you to make this as lovely a world as possible.
I'm not saying that I survived. God did pluck me out of a burning building to give me a second chance. That's the way I see it. But you know what? I was one of those whose time didn't come. And I thank God every day for that, for giving me that time.
What's the message you'd like us to take away 10 years after 9/11?
Most importantly, do not fear terrorism. If you change your life in iota because of the terrorists, they win. And I refuse to let them win. And please, 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 never forget.
The lesson you want people to take from 10 years later after 9/11?
Always remember and learn so we do better.
What's the lesson 10 years later?
Your family is the most important thing in this world. Never ever forget that. There isn't a day that doesn't go by that I tell my wife and my kids that I love them, because you know what? It might be the last time I say it.
How lucky am I to have been able to spend time with the three of you? You are wonderful. Ari, thank you. Morty, thank you. Liz, thank you.
Thank you.
And I'm sorry we had to be here to relive such a painful moment, but it happened, and it was very important to be able to share this with you. And I know you've all gone out of your way to give us time. I thank you very, very much. Ari,
you.
Morty,
Pleasure.
and
Thank
Liz.
you.
As always, I appreciate any response you would have to the ideas expressed by Ari Schonbrun, Morty Dzikansky, or Elizabeth Goren, each of whom have written a book. Ari's book is entitled Miracles and Fate on 78, and Liz's book is Beyond the Reach of Ladders, and Morty's book is Terrorist Cop. All worth your read. I hope you pick them up. As always, I invite you to be in touch with me with any thoughts or comments you may have to the ideas expressed. Please email me, write me, post on our Facebook wall, or tweet me. I look forward to hearing from you. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who can send a tax-deductible contribution of $36 or more to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media to help support our programming. Tax-deductible checks may be made out to GEM and mailed to GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. Please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD, and we thank you for your kind support.